There's nothing quite like the pressure of feeling so deeply emotionally, mentally, physically, or even financially responsible for a parent or even a partner in a way that feels like you exist to rotate around their needs. And yet what often happens in enmeshed families and enmeshment trauma type relationships is that we often also feel that we also need to be that close to that person. So that enmeshment is not just what's happening from child to parent, it's parent to child, especially as we become adults and oftentimes have been living in this enmeshment experience our whole lives and don't know how to get out of it and feel this equal sense of burden and like complete responsibility for them, but also a desperate fear, a desperation around what will we ever do without them. And I was really thinking about this topic when I watched the documentary called Pretty Baby with Brooke Shields. If you've not seen it, I highly recommend it. It is literally my entire generational story of Brooke being who she is and holding such a massive role and impact in my own journey, because seeing all of these images of Brooke, and it was like, oh, I remember that, and right, it's just incredible. And I think she's a pretty amazing human, so I highly recommend it. But one of the things I want to talk about, and I'm going to come back to the video I was going to make on being selfish, I'm going to post that on Monday, because I want to talk about this while kind of Brooke is making the rounds, because many of you are probably watching this documentary, is that I'd always known about the relationship or heard about it through the media between Brooke and her mom, Terry. And it was known that Terry was Brooke's manager, I think one of the original momagers, that there was a very intense relationship. And over the years, it seemed to trickle out that there was an intensity to that relationship that I felt very much that I related to because of my own mom in terms of that really intense relationship. What I didn't know is that, as Brooke talks about in the documentary, that her mom struggled with alcohol use disorder throughout the course of Brooke's life. It seems pretty significant that was, a significant impact. But I think in addition to it seems like, and I wish that, and Brooke is talking about it, and the documentary is meant to cover a lot of things. But to me, this was the part that I was the most, fascinated by, because it really did have an impact on what happened to Brooke, how things happened to Brooke, the life that she's played out, the things that to me as a psychologist, I would say would be the understandable wounds and challenges, both with herself and her relationships. And what I really felt was that most likely there was already an enmeshment there, a dynamic, a parentification happening, and certainly the alcohol piece or the alcohol use disorder would have made all of that so much more intense. And so I can't speak on that relationship, but my guess is that a lot of the factors were there that were generational, that were part of the way that Brooke's mom, Terry, approached her as having Brooke be her child, and that lack of really boundary from sort of the beginning around the hierarchy of parent and child. So I want to talk about enmeshment trauma and parentification as they relate to this documentary, or really triggered by the documentary, but really bring it home for you in terms of what it might look like in your own story, in your own life, and some things that you can do to work on it if you are still in an enmeshed relationship with anyone, and certainly with a parent. So let's talk about quickly what enmeshment is. Enmeshment is really about this lack of boundary between, historically in enmeshed families, although it could be two partners, no boundary. It's like this, right? The child basically is taught that in this family there are no separations, there are no real boundaries around topics, around behaviors, around expectations. There isn't a healthy hierarchy. It's like we're in this together, we're two peas in a pod, and the child assumes emotional, psychological responsibility for the parent. And this is why there are so many adults that still have this relationship with their mothers or fathers or parents, because it has been this way their whole life. And there's a tremendous amount of guilt that makes it really difficult to separate. And oftentimes these are adults who are financially, mentally, physically supporting their parents. So in childhood, they assumed the adult role emotionally, and now they are doing the adult role. And many times these are grown, their parents are fully capable, but they've become more and more childlike as the relationships have gone on. And the really difficult part, and this is kind of what I talk a lot about though, is like I'm saying, the enmeshment is between you and the parent. It's not just you towards the parent. You are also in that pea in the pod with them. And that is what makes it so difficult to do your own work and to feel like you're allowed and entitled to be a separate person, because you've been wired to hold all of the guilt for that parent's happiness, well-being, purpose since the day for many of you came out of the womb, or since the divorce or the loss or the separation. That can often trigger these things too. And so alongside this sort of boundarylessness of enmeshment is often parentification, because like I'm saying, parentification is basically when you act in an adult parentifying or parent type role, mentally, physically, emotionally, financially toward your parent. And interestingly, in the documentary, and then also in the interview between Brooke and Drew Barrymore, both of them as children seem to be not only emotionally entangled with their mothers, but were financially supporting for and providing for their mothers as children. And I think also Jeanette McCurdy talks a bit about this in her book. And this is so significant. This is like since the day you can, really remember you've been responsible. So what happens is the child often acts in parenting roles, helping the parent through things, coaching them, loving them, being the support. And yet when push comes to shove, they're often told, well, what are you doing? You can't tell me what to do. You're a child, right? So it's very confusing. A lot of these people grow up being, put in adult roles, but then told you're not the adult, which is just so confusing. So that's another issue, and that can play out. But what does it look like? Let's just go through quickly kind of what happens in enmeshed families. And oftentimes this can be, like I said, generational or triggered by traumas, and oftentimes I think it's fed by things like addictions, mental illness, mental health issues like a personality disorder, right? It could be narcissism, could be untreated borderline or immaturity in some way, or just, some generational dynamic. Could be the parent is just very traumatized. But whatever the reasons are, the roles are they're like this, and there's often this expectation for the child to really rotate around the parent. So there's often a lack of physical and emotional boundaries, what we talk about, what we share, how emotional we are, sleeping in the same bed together for years, no privacy, things like that, physical boundaries, sharing rooms together, which I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but there's a point where, regardless of your philosophy on, co-sleeping or whatever, at some point, I do believe it interferes with the child's separation and sense of self. And of course, in certain communities and places in the world, there are families that all sleep together in the same room. So I'm not pathologizing that. I am talking about this really from a more experience where there's just, even if you're in the same room, it doesn't mean you're enmeshing with your child, right? You may have to share a room because you can't afford a different space, but you understand the psychological boundary. So it's not just that. So I don't want you to get confused that I'm saying it's a bad thing. My point is though that oftentimes these parents keep their kids very close to them one way or another, and that might be one way. But basically there's no growing and developing of separation. When you have this in your family, you don't really think about what's best for you. You're often first thinking about, well, if I tell my mom no, or my dad, or this partner, it's going to hurt their feelings. Like, oh, they're going to get mad at me. So you start to think with the lens of what they need from you first before what you want. You feel responsible for their happiness, their well-being, their state of mind. So a lot of this, what happens is, as like we're doing work in therapy and we talk about how to help set boundaries, the adult child will feel like, oh, they're going to completely like fall apart. Like they can't handle that, right? Or they're going to blow up at me and I can't handle that. So it really is this thing where you feel like without you implementing things, it's all going to be bad and affect how they function, their happiness, their well-being. You feel like you're not allowed, you feel guilty and ashamed, or both, around if you want to have less contact, like you're not allowed to set boundaries. It's like there's a deeply wired belief inside that you don't get to have that. And frankly, that even if you do, and this goes to the next video, you're often told you're selfish. Like, how dare you want a separate space or separate thing or more, difficulties. or more difficulties, or more boundaries that are creating difficulty for you. And this often it looks like a phone call. And I have so many patients who feel like they have to call this parent every single day, and they are full-on adults. Now, if they want to, that's fine. But it feels like there's just this, they're not even getting anything out of the phone calls. They just feel like they have to do it, but they dread it. It's a burden, or they feel, stressed by it. So it's just like, I must. There's no space for my own free will. They often feel like that what you do affects their financial well-being, their emotional well-being, their sense of achievement or success, their self-worth is either based on what you do for them or what you do that reflects upon them, which can be very narcissistically driven in those kind of families. That your life centers around the parent, that you must take on adult responsibilities because they won't be able to, or they can't handle it. It could be running the home. It could be being the parent's best friend and therapist. It could be raising the other children. But all of these are in the extreme. Like a little bit of these things happen in families, but when it's a massive pattern, that's what we're talking about. Your parents often will hold you back from encouraging you to fully live your own dream, or maybe let's say you've always wanted to live in France, which is, of course, that's my dream. But you feel like you can't because you can't leave them. And maybe they have a health issue or mental health issue. I mean, it could be for real reasons. But at the end of the day, no matter what it is, even if there was some substitute for your care, you don't feel like they could handle that or that you're allowed to do that. And even for you, it feels like, well, I want that, but I can never handle that either because I have so much anxiety around being near them too. So you might abandon dreams or careers or jobs, or you don't go to medical school because that would mean leaving the city that you grew up in, and they can't handle that, right? They don't really provide a space for you to deal with conflict and how to say no and self-advocate. That all feels very threatening. You often have a difficult time creating a sense of who you are because you've learned to rotate so much of your life around them. Oftentimes you become honestly chronically hypervigilant in detecting their facial expressions, their mood, their mind, what they need, their emotions, because so much of your life meant you had to rotate. You were so enmeshed that your well-being literally depended upon theirs. So you overread and overinterpret things and make meaning out of them, which often makes you a sponge. Maybe you're very empathic and highly sensitive, but then that is the role you play in lots of relationships. It's almost like you just have learned to have that kind of classic outside-in orientation that we talk about in anxious and often disorganized attachment. And so at the end of the day, there's just no place where you're you and they are them, right? It's just always connected in some way. There's no tolerance for differences or separation. And you are often a willing participant in it as well. You might complain about it all day long, but deep inside you're often deeply attached and afraid to separate as well. And that's what makes it so difficult, because you've been operating in this role your whole life. So what can you do to work on this? If you are currently in an enmeshed relationship with anyone, frankly, these are the things I would recommend. Number one is to acknowledge how you really feel. Give yourself permission. If nobody was judging you and you could just say what it felt like, and it might be mixed. It might be I love them so much, but sometimes I feel so stressed by them and so burdened by them. Give yourself permission to write it down. Or I know many of you said, oh, that feels unsafe with certain kind of parents. So speak it out loud in your car, put it in your phone, in your notes, delete it, write it all out and then delete it on a computer, whatever it is. But purge out how you really feel. If there was no guilt and no shame and you could let yourself just say, or if you can't just do that because even that feels guilty, try to reflect on the next time you get frustrated or annoyed or feel overwhelmed by them. How are you feeling right then, and write that down. So you want to be honest about that. The next thing is acknowledge that this thing you're stuck in might be doing something for you too. And so what often happens is in enmeshed relationships, even though it's not our fault and we were wired to be in this relationship, if I have a very enmeshed, let's say, parent, and I have learned because of that parent that relationships are stressful and scary and I don't want to put myself out there, then I really use that parent as my emotional partner in life. And that is keeping me and holding me back from putting myself out there in friendships or relationships or whatever. So it's often doing something for us too that we're not aware of. And I've talked about this. For me, it was I couldn't imagine, how could I be with her anymore with my mom? But also I was terrified when I was in it of something happening to her. How will I ever survive? Because it was such an intensely enmeshed and parentified relationship. So it was doing something for me. And in fact, it served a role in my marriage because it alleviated some stress and I got some needs met at times through her, which took my focus off what was not happening over here. So it can serve a purpose and it can help with loneliness or isolation, whatever. But there is a price you're paying and you want to acknowledge that. Number 3, do identity work. And you're like, well, probably what does that mean? It's like, go discover who you are. There are so many great books on, I guess, like, what is that book? What color is your parachute or whatever? But part of it is identifying, like, who are you? What are your dreams? What are your goals? What do you love? What do you hate? Like, the more you can create a separate sense of self, not defined by what that parent thinks or that partner thinks is success or important or meaningful, but to really push yourself, try new hobbies, join a meetup, read books, watch videos, take courses, whatever it is on, these hobbies you have, these interests you have, listen to podcasts, like whatever it is, and get more and more clear on who you are, and then try to act out that part of yourself that maybe you've neglected in terms of your identity. And oftentimes go back to childhood. If you don't know now, like, well, I don't know what I care about, which is common. Go back to, like, what did you play with in childhood? What shows did you watch? What books did you like? What things did you play with your friends? Sometimes those key pieces hold a lot of information for us. The next thing is to establish separation and boundaries. So to begin to create even just little boundaries, little things like I'm gonna start calling you every other day, mom, dad, parent, whatever. Start to define your goals for yourself. So maybe you're like, well, I can't imagine, talking once a week now. But that would be a goal. I would love to talk to this parent for half an hour, once a week. It's just not half an hour or an hour every day. So identify your goals, work towards separating, and start to set little boundaries and learn to tolerate, that's the next thing, the guilt it's going to place on you and potentially the unhappy emotions they're going to express towards you. So because you've been wired to focus so much on what they want and need, their displeasure with you can feel terrible. And so part of our work, I think for so many of us who have these kind of childhoods, is learning how to tolerate other people's displeasure with us, right? That's a huge one. If they don't like us, if they're mad at us, if they feel hurt by us, but if we know we're not trying to hurt anybody or do anything wrong, but our own identity or separate self is a threat to someone else, that's a problem. That's a problem right there. So you want to work on that. And that might be doing work on, your nervous system, how to deal with anxiety, maybe going to therapy, which is my last one, which is to get help and support. But learning how to deal with that rise of emotion, the guilt, the shame, the pain, the fear, the anxiety, whatever, the sadness, as you do this work is really important. So Polyvagal Theory, nervous system regulation, things like that, alongside the mental piece that often accompanies those ideas. Look at your compulsive caretaking patterns. This is huge. A lot of us have been wired to be compulsive caretakers. And what it does is it helps us feel a sense of value in the world and it gives us meaning and purpose. But while we're doing that, we are denying our own pain, our own needs, our own sense of self. And so you might be a compulsive caretaker with this parent, but there's a very good chance you do it with your friends, even with your kids. It's like too much, your partner, your job, whatever it is. So to work on reducing, not removing, because you're probably a great caregiver, but you are sacrificing yourself, your own health, your own self-care, your own needs in the service of this. And this is often why we don't know who we are, because we spent our whole life rotating around everyone else, because that was what we were trained to do. So you have to be willing to, the next thing is be willing to, change your patterns and your interactions. Like I said, you have to be willing to say, I'm going to set the boundary of talking every other day, even though on the days we don't talk, I might have anxiety because I'm used to offloading my stress with this parent. It's being willing to do things to change and to start to notice how you feel. Number 8 is to deal with the anxiety of separation. So the separation of itself is going to create, kind of going back to the strong emotions thing. You can expect that because that is what you've been taught to do. So you want to work on that. Look at number 9, if you are recreating these enmeshment patterns in your own family, with your partner, with your kids. I mean, we often just do what was done to us. That's just what we do. And there can be a beautiful, close bond. It's not about, I'm only the parent, you're only the child. It's just that there are places to allow for friendship connection and places, I think, to be a parent. And only you can decide how strict those boundaries are. But I think when you're too far at the only friend end and you're too far at the only parent end, you miss a lot of connection with your kids. And I don't have the perfect answer to parenting. That is true. But I do believe that as your kids get older, if you can build some connection to friendship, that's great. But your kids can't believe that they were put on this earth to be your friend, your therapist, your best friend first. So you want to look at, am I doing that? Am I oversharing? Am I inadvertently talking about my marriage too much in front of my kids? I have this problem a lot of the time, especially since we're doing telehealth, is that patients who will talk to me about their marriage with their kids in the car, I'm like, this is not a great place for us. It is not a good place. But they don't even think twice about it. Or they think that that's just normal, right? They don't understand that there should be a boundary between your kids hearing about things. Even if your kids agree with you, yeah, daddy is never here, or mommy's never here, or daddy is critical. Like, there's a place to honor their feelings. But that boundarylessness itself can create this really us against them dynamic between parents, right? So you want to look at that. And lastly, like I said, getting help and support. This is really important, that whether it is through books, podcasts, courses, therapy, ideally, if you have enmeshment trauma and you are a parentified child, I'm not gonna lie, it's really hard to do the work, at least without dedicating yourself to some kind of book or program or support system. It's like the guilt is immense. The intensity of these relationships is so significant. I can even feel it in therapy if I approach, like, I can see it right away. If I go in too soon, it takes me sometimes 6 months to a year with some patients to really get into what's happening, because they have learned to be the protectors of those parents, and they will perceive me talking about this as me trying to, as if it's a threat. Now, they often know it's not great inside, but they've been so wired to protect that parent that psychologically it can be difficult for them. So obviously, if they come to me in the beginning and they know they have this, but sometimes I don't even get this information until, literally 4 or 5 months in. It just depends. Other times it's very clear from the beginning and we can talk about it, and I'm much more likely to bring it up because of the content I make. Most people that find me now, if they aren't referred from previous patients or current patients, they've found my content online, and I think we tend to find each other because they resonate with a lot of the things I talk about, plus their own stories. So it's easier now. But it is a very protected relationship psychologically. And I remember being in it and knowing it was so toxic, but also thinking, like, I don't know how I could ever not be in this, because this is so, such an intense, important relationship. And yet it was the source of a lot of my trauma. And as I've said in a million videos, it wasn't always bad. And that's the thing. In all of these enmeshed relationships, there's usually some part that is meeting some need for us. Got the icky lips from too much lip gloss. So anyway, that's what's happening, and I hope you'll find this video helpful. Thank you so much for being here. I am trying to create more how-to videos because I know everybody wants that, and I feel like I've made so many videos on explaining these things, these general topics I talk a lot about with childhood CPTSD and things like that. So I hope you will find this helpful. I really suggest, if you have these triggers, to really watch, for not just for that, because it's also a really interesting documentary. And Brooke is truly just a lovely, beautiful human. It's so clear, and her own daughters are in the end of it, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's like she's just an icon of my entire childhood, my adulthood. I mean, and I could feel these differences in how she was presented, from her images to the way she always seemed so sweet and so loving and so more pure. It was just like this weird thing, and now it all makes a lot of sense. But I've always thought what an intelligent, lovely human being she is. And it was, like I said, also interesting. You might want to Google the videos that are interviews between Drew and Brooke in terms of their own childhoods and how much of each of them having their own mom issues and those enmeshed relationships have impacted their lives and their stories. So anyway, thanks for being here. Have a beautiful weekend, and I will see you Monday. Take care.